All right. Welcome, everyone. We'll give it a second for folks to get in here. We want to thank both you all as participants and our speakers for your patience, and just shout out to the tech team who are making impossible things possible in this time of hybridity and using virtual tools to try to connect with one another. Just want to thank you for not regarding it robbery to spend some time hearing from these lifesavers who will be sharing information with us today. My name is Ashley Woodard Henderson. My homies call me Ash. I use she, her pronouns, or any said respectfully. And my day job is that I spend a lot of time being the first Black woman to serve as an executive director of the Highlander Research and Education Center with the Reverend Alan Maxfield Steele. It is my honor to greet you from Tennessee and to be able to kick it with these three incredible women who do life-saving work. But before I introduce you to them, I want to just remind you of the space that you have said yes to. This panel is about building community power to advance climate justice, equity, and health. You all know better than most, because of this incredible gathering, that across the world, communities historically bearing the brunt of environmental harms are actually building power to shape what happens on the land that they steward, including the power to say no to projects that they deem harmful, taking part in enforcement of environmental regulation, and the creating of opportunities to lead necessary transitions on community terms, according to their informed consent. These speakers that you're going to hear from today are going to share with you why they are combining efforts to create a global movement across impacted communities and hold space for others to consider how their current environmental injustice struggles might connect with this global movement for justice. It's going to be an opportunity to build solidarity and practice across our experiences of local injustice, and to imagine, to envision what it might look like to harness community power on a global scale. The speakers that you're going to hear from today will talk about the challenges and opportunities they're facing, the successes and the impacts of building global environmental justice movements, and the next steps that we might be able to take, the calls to action to support folks moving their environmental justice work from local to global. So that's what you've said yes to. We hope you are in the right place. We're excited to get into it. Thank you for your patience again. Now I have the esteemed honor and privilege to introduce you to our speakers today. First, I'm going to introduce you to Samantha Hamilton, the Live Well Springfield manager of Public Health Institute for Western Massachusetts. Secondly, I get to introduce you to Caro Martinez, Climate Justice Director at the Environmental Health Coalition. And last, but certainly not least, I get to introduce you to Taren Evans, the Environmental Justice Director at the Coalition of Communities of Color. So now we're going to spend the next little chunk of time getting to go deep into their work. So Samantha, I'm going to kick it to you. I'm going to ask the tech team to bring up your PowerPoint, and we are going to get into this work. Y'all give it up to Samantha in the chat as she comes.
Thank you. So my name is Samantha Hamilton. I am the Live Well Springfield Program Manager at the Public Health Institute of Western Mass. And the Public Health Institute is a convening research and evaluation organization. We do three wonderful things greatly in our region. So we do coalition building through convening, research and evaluation through regional and state grants and projects, and evaluation for our local planning partners as needed. Next slide. So where is Springfield? Sometimes that's the biggest question to answer. Where are we located? So we thought it'd be great to give you a snapshot. Springfield is located in the western part of Massachusetts, so typically called Western Mass. And we are predominantly in the pink and red area as Hampden County. And specifically, Springfield is in the red, shaded area. So our population is about 154,000 people. Our diversity includes 46% Latino, 30% white, 21% African American, and 3% Asian, respectively. And our environmental issues are issues that concerns us. This is not excluding the other variables, but our primary big issues are asthma, chronic health issues, food access, housing and homelessness, and extreme heat and weather disasters. Next slide, please. So my intention is to kind of frame the work of Live Well. Live Well is a coalition of about 30 plus community-based organizations. And we convene these partners at various times. This is a longstanding coalition around different issues. Our primary focus now has been environmental justice work, and we've picked that up out of the grassroots work that has happened in our community. But other initiatives that we focused on are on age-friendly cities, the built environment, and Resident Advisory Council, which I want to dig deep into that regarding the transformational power of community, and research doing a road study regarding the built environment. So those are some of the caveats to some of the things that we do as an organization. Next slide. So one of our big strengths is the power of convening people in community. And one of the strong initiatives that we started was our Resident Advisory Council, and that's bringing community residents with the lived experience of the health issues or health indicators that are happening in our community to the table to help us plan together. So we established a Resident Advisory Council, which engaged residents, and the residents help us in the planning, implementation, evaluation, and decision-making process. And like I said, their lived experience, their professional experience are the key things that we want to add to the story to bring on the bigger picture. Next slide. So the structure of our initiative, which is funded under our Climate Change and Health Equity Grant with Kresge, is that we have members that we call stakeholders, residents that we call resident advocates, and partners that are funded through the grant. We share in the power, we share power through decision-making, planning, and implementation. And our vested interest of why we are all at the table is based on the mission, the resources and funding available, and the passion for community change. So this is part of our work. We also hold a 1-to-1 ratio regarding who's at the table. So for every one resident, there's a stakeholder or partner that matches that voice. And that was intentional in hopes that we didn't have two residents sitting at the table while there's 20 professionals or 20 environmental justice advocates where their voices would be lost. So balancing that out allows residents to collectively speak up about issues that related to them and also challenge our process as well. Next slide. So one thing we wanted to establish is like, how do we make decisions in an equitable way? And we crafted this model which shows the flow of how information comes in, goes out, and how decisions are made. At the hub, which is at the center of our work, is our Climate Change and Health Equity Committee, funded through our Kresge grant. And we hold those stakeholders and partners that I mentioned before, along with the residents. Outside the fold, on the latter side, our core team and our marketing team work behind the scenes to do the day-to-day next step level project and decision-making that can happen. But that's after getting feedback and input from the residents and partners at the table. And then we solicited community feedback and input through focus groups, surveys, workshops, or community conversations from the broader community, which keeps them informed about our work on a regular basis, but also to let them know when we've made decision regarding and where their input was applied. So this flow chart kind of just flows the power of how we share in decision making, and that how it can be changed depending on how communities give us feedback, as well as how our committee wants to proceed with the process. Next slide. The other framework is that we follow the Interactive Institute of Social Change model of a process, results, or relationships. So sometimes we got to ask ourselves, are you a process person? Are you a results person, or are you a relationship person? I am absolutely a relationship person. I've used my relationships to leverage opportunities for communities to get involved, to bring people at the table. But with that, we also follow the structured process. So in shifting it to be more transformational, in a sense, we said the process has to be clear and transparent. So all our stakeholders and partners knows the process in which we're taking to get to the end goal. The other piece is they have to have shared ownership. We don't have to own the results of the results, but we have to share in ownership of the results. So whether a partner starts with us in the beginning of the grant and has to leave, the end result of our success is cumulative. It's not because of the work of the few that ended the project, but all of the great work of people who've come before us, which is specifically strong for environmental justice work. It's not what I'm doing now. It's what everyone has done before to bring awareness about the issues that impact us most. So we take ownership of those results. And relationships being transformative in a way, it's not just that we ask folks to come to sit at this table, our table, and hear what we have to say, but they're also where I'm also sitting at other tables that I'm not leading, where our residents and at our table are now picking up the agenda and leading. So, who plans the agenda leads the meeting, right? So if we can have our residents take part in agenda planning and setting, they now are transitioning into more power space. So we also, on a heartwarming note, we have relationships with folks on a human level about knowing how they're living in this environment, how they're living in the community, what are some barriers? Because most of the time, some of our residents, community partners are showing up after a long day, after a trying week, after family issues. We all showed up during and still now after COVID. So recognizing that, when we ask people to be involved, our intention is to let them know what we're asking for, but knowing that it doesn't have to end there. It can lead to something greater. So we hope for a transformative relationship. Next slide. So one of the many things we've done is lift up the real people, the folks that are actually doing the work in our campaign projects. And one of them, we did a Guess What I Did campaign. This is now 2 years from now, which we're relaunching that campaign with more residents. But this is Awilda, and Awilda is a resident advocate for healthy eating in Springfield. And she has she works in the school system. But Awilda says, I want to see a better world. I want to be a part of the solution. So I am. So we really want to highlight advocacy as part of our brand to ensure that people know that being involved and being at the table, the folks there look just like you. They're from your community, and they make time for something that they feel is important to them. Next slide. So the other piece is that we want to do is integrate the voices of community residents in the problem. When we talk about issues of environmental justice, we see it from the statistics, the research, the report. But more powerful is when other communities of color tell other communities of color that this is really, really important for me and for you. So this is Amari last year at the Jazz and Roots Festival, who stood up in front of an audience about 3,000 to 4,000 people to share her why for being involved in our climate justice work. And she shares that I need you, my people of color, to understand that this concerns you first. When your living environment becomes unlivable, what do you think would happen to you first? So speaking to the urgency of the need, the importance of putting communities of color in the conversation, Amari's at the table, but she's also inviting other folks to say, this is our problem now, and it's going to be our problem in the future. Next slide. Another piece of our work is, building capacity for our resident advocates. So some of the workshops that we've done in the past is called Flexing Your Civic Muscle. This is in which our residents learn about a specific policy that we're advocating for, but they break it down. We break it down with them to a context of who is the city official involved in this process? Where can we find them? What is our strategy to engage them? And they asked us, help us to understand, well, how do we explain this back to the broader community? How do they explain it to their neighbor so that it makes sense to them? And so how do you give prime examples of that? The other piece is storytelling, which is a big part of kind of shaping the picture of the who, the how, and the why. It's important in campaign messaging, bringing real people into the fold. Our next engagement for capacity building will be around data to policy action. How do we take what we know within our research and our findings to a place where people can connect that with advocacy and put that in front of those decision makers that are in position of power to change policy legislation? And then also understanding health equity. And this folds in continuously of talking about how this impacts us individually, collectively, and who are most impacted by the issue. Next slide. So, and on another note, we also want to capture the evolution and integration of how residents have taken on more leadership role and more position of power in understanding why it matters to them. So this is Emma. Emma's a resident advocate with us, and she shares her story in this op-ed about how when she grew up and there was burning, an incendiary burning at near her local housing authority, she didn't think anything of it, right? She didn't think there was a problem until now, years later, where she's asking herself, you know, why did my husband have COPD when he had chronic respiratory issues when he wasn't a chronic smoker? Why does my grandchildren have asthma? Why does my daughter develop asthma over time? So these are the stories that we want to pull forward to show the tangible examples of why advocacy is important. So Emma says, as Emma puts it, we have to stand for what's right. Some of them have passed on trying to stand up, but I want my legacy to be that I have a good fight to help out my people all over the community. Next slide. So I want to shift now to one of another piece of our work. So the initial conversation was focused on how we've worked with residents in a transformational way to have and hold their voice as part of the project. But one of the special things that we were able to do because of the history of our coalition was to do an extreme heat tabletop exercise with Healthcare Without Harm. The project was called Partnerships for Climate Resiliency, a practical guide for community-based disaster planning for healthcare. So we want to just dive into an example in which our work connects with not just community, but also with community-based partner organizations and institutions that are looking at making a difference. Next slide. So this climate work was, or this tabletop exercise was funded by Healthcare Without Harm. This project included our Live Well Springfield partners, are led by our Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, Bay State Health, the Public Health Institute of Western Mass, and Healthcare Without Harm also assisted with the coordination as well. Next slide. And in this tabletop exercise, we were able to engage community-based organization, municipalities, health sectors, businesses, community residents, arts and culture community. And there have been tabletop exercises, extreme heat exercises done before. What is unique to this project is that this is the first time they were integrating community-based organizations in the tabletop exercise. So this is a different lens on how to do an extreme heat tabletop, where now we're leaning into the strengths and resources of community-based organizations and getting a residential perspective on what a person going through that exercise would consider as problems or thought points for an extreme heat day or series of events. Next slide. So the desired outcome for this tabletop exercise was bring together community voices to standardize emergency preparedness exercise, to continue to integrate climate resiliency in healthcare facilities and the communities they serve, and to continue relationship building between community members and city emergency management and planning partners or planning staff. So those were the desired outcomes. Next slide. So overall, the importance of community-based partners being in the planning is that they have great buy-in and power and decision-making when it comes to understanding their community. This exercise or this tabletop tool is then used broadly in the community. So it shows the step-by-step instructions for engaging community partners on how to run a community-based climate resiliency exercise. It's a template now that we've demoed it that you can integrate in your community. And it could be, and consider the template as something that could be a starting point. You know, if you haven't been engaging in community prior to this in an intentional way, this could be a baseline activity to start bringing folks who are typically not talking about climate or extreme heat days to the table to consider how they could approach it. And the lessons learned from the extreme heat exercise running Springfield, Massachusetts, with a health system and community partners was not just Springfield. It was Hampden County. So we looked at rural partners, urban partners, suburban partners were brought into the fold. So this can be done not just in a city setting, but in any community that experienced extreme heat days. Next slide. So from a community's perspective, we believe the longstanding relationship that with community-based organization that Live Well Springfield had was the reason that our coalition was great at convening this project. We built on the relationships and trust and reputation abilities of networking and seeking diverse representation. Like I said, arts and culture was involved. Sometimes our heads can't wrap around how could we use arts and culture? And actually we've got arts and culture in our advocacy work now because we're going to be doing a climate justice mural this coming year. And we actually have a paint party this Saturday. So arts and culture has an intentional purpose in bringing forward the culture of environmental advocacy, the reflection of it in communities, and also a very creative way to have a different discussion. Sometimes it's not the data that's going to drive, but how people see it and frame it. So we also then, with our work, the intention was to work with organizations and individuals and groups most impacted by disaster relief. So we had residents that live in predominantly poor neighborhoods with poor health outcomes that have a lot of issues of asthma and respiratory health issues. So our intention was to say, can we get that person, that example of that person, to come in and tell us when we're going through this exercise, what makes sense and what not makes sense, what to consider and what not to consider. Sometimes through these exercises, we forget, what about the folks that care about their animals? What are the folks with disabilities and limited mobility? How do they know about what to do in this scenario and what the response would be? So the power of us being the guided partner with our other organization, the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, was intentional because we could fold into those dynamics. Next slide. So what came out of this, right? So this great work of putting together this exercise, having a guide and providing some recommendations led to some statewide amendments. So for this work of bringing forward these priorities and setting up this plan, there were amendments in our current climate bill, which is sitting at the governor's desk. There's so much power right here, in which he can sign, where there was amendments to consider pathways for emergency storage uses such as batteries, backup to be paired with community cooling centers in environmental justice communities. There's an amendment to expand abilities for Mass CEC's equitable program to also include community-based organizations and also to include hospitals and healthcare facilities within the scope of this emergency storage study. So we learned so much from this tabletop exercise that our local state officials made changes to a climate bill that I will say again, that is sitting at the governor's desk and could be signed any moment right now based on the convening of our community. So those are kind of the power of spaces. Next slide. So I also want to leave you all with some community engagement resources and resiliency efforts. There's so much that we can do. There's so much that we've done with community regarding integrating their voices in the conversation, capacity building, folding in, working with community-based organizations that have done this before. But I'll preface again, this work is a snapshot of a long-standing environmental justice advocacy, and our wins are cumulative. This win, if it's in this policy bill, is because of all of the advocacy work that has come before me and will come after me because the work never stops. Next slide. And if there's any questions, folks would like to reach out to me, my contact information is there. It's shamilton@Public Health Institute, publichealthwm.org. And you can also find some of this information on our Live Well Springfield website. Thank you all so much for having me.
Y'all give it, I mean, you're already getting love in the chat, but if we could just give one more round of love to Samantha for this incredible work. I mean, both to not only center the importance of community-based organizations and the directly most disproportionately impacted by the series of injustices that folks are facing, whether in health or climate or, just racial equity, economic equity, all of these things, but to do so in a way that not only multiplies the ways that people build power, right, through relationship, through process, through results driven work, but to do it in such a way that intentionally provides folks a new model to follow in your footsteps is no small feat. So thank you for sharing that with us, Samantha. We are going to quickly transition to our beloved Caro to take us through our second presentation of the day.
Thank you. And my hope is that the tech will work. I have 3 videos for the audience to enjoy, so be patient with me. I think we're gonna do this. So my name is Carolina. I'm the Climate Justice Campaign Director at Environmental Health Coalition. Environmental Health Coalition is based in San Diego. We are a 42-year-old environmental justice organization. We are community-based. We believe that the communities at the front lines of the climate crisis are also the best to provide the solutions and guide us forward. And so let me just provide a little bit of context. This is Coronavirus Screen 3.0. It's a screening methodology that we use in the state of California to identify most impacted communities. If you look closely to the map, you'll see, I'm not sure that you see my arrow moving, but if you do, you'll notice that we are, the communities that are the most red are also a Bayfront community. And that's the community of Barrio Logan. And if you look farther south in a more orangey, like dark orangey, you'll see National City and also the community of City Heights, where the 15 freeway and 805 connect. And so those are the communities that we work with. We also work across the border with a community in Tijuana. It's called Chimpalcingo. And so today I'm going to present 2 of our campaigns that are both transportation related. One of them is on freight related issues, and the other one has to do with public transit. So the first one has to do with the port. Just as I mentioned, Barrio Logan and National City are port communities. They are, when we think of goods movement, it's all the stuff that we get. In Barrio Logan, we have a lot of diesel trucks that are transporting bananas. So when we think about goods movement, I think it's really important to think about what makes it to the table that we're eating every day. And bananas is definitely not something that grows in the United States or in this region. And so Barrio Logan, it becomes a receiver of all these bananas, and they get distributed. But they don't walk by themselves. They have to be transported with diesel trucks. So we have a diesel zone in Barrio Logan, and in National City, we have also the port of entry extends there. And 1 out of every 8 cars imported into the United States comes through the community of National City. So you'll see right here a photo of a big old ship downloaded all these vehicles. And so all of that has a lot of impacts. As a result, we have about 84% of the cancer risk. A recent study found that 84% of cancer risk in both in the community of Barrio Logan and National City. These are communities that are communities of color, and that are also at the top of coronavirus screen, at 95% community in the state of California. So we have a lot of issues, but we also have a lot of solutions, and our communities are working to address that. Before I continue on to the solutions, I did wanted to bring this COVID-19 case map, and you'll see that also those communities where you have the most impact, you also see a lot of COVID cases are concentrated in our communities. And so, but we also have solutions. The community organized heavily to advance on the side of the air pollution control district and advance the following goals by 2030 to reduce the cancer risk below 10 million, to reduce diesel particulate matter by 70%, and to ensure that we transition trucks to be fully electric by 2030. The state of California has a goal of 2035. So San Diego is saying, no, we need 2030. And while that sounds aggressive, we got to think about, let's think of right now, if we have a 2-year-old living in Barrio Logan, we're going to make him or her wait till 2030 to reduce this pollution. So 2030 is still late, but it is a huge victory for the community. So in 2021, those goals were advanced via the Community Emissions Reduction Plan, which is also community driven. It's a plan that was adopted by the Air Pollution Control District. And that also, just like Samantha was saying, all these victories leverage each other. So that was at the Air Pollution Control District side. And then on the Port of San Diego side, which is another decision-making body, we were able to advance by putting all this coalition together of labor and community groups and interest groups, a maritime clean air strategy that advanced the port committed to transitioning all these trucks that transport all these bananas to be electric by 2030. And so now we have 2 different agencies committing to very specific air quality outcomes. So that's on the freight side. I'm going to move on to the transit work, which is the work that I am more directly working on. And so we believe that transit is a lifeline, and that's the name of our campaign work. And so just to set up the context, is that in the state of California, about 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation. And once you take that 40% out and look at what are the sources, what are the transportation sources, we see that in the state of California, 72% of that comes from passenger vehicles. So cars are a problem, a huge problem in the state of California. And once we zoom in into San Diego, we see that it's very similar. We're part of the state, and so we reflect that 41% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation. And then we see that 79% of drivers are having to drive by themselves. And then, so you have all this metal machines driving by themselves and having to pollute the environment because actually there's not a lot of options. And for our communities, for our low-income communities, only 12% of our residents, of our low-income residents, have access to reliable transit in San Diego. And we also know that 70% of the jobs in San Diego region are not reachable by transit. So imagine if we had reliable transit, what that would mean to the economy to be able to connect jobs to transit. So, but we got solutions. Our transit riders are organizing and advancing their priorities. And so we created a storytelling project. And we were lucky enough to have funding to make this stories come to life. And I think they're really beautiful. And I lost my train of thought. So the storytelling project has been very efficient in informing the policy process. And I'm going to share this video. So let me see if this works. Share screen. So this video, just before I cue it, is that is the introductory video to the 10 priorities, to the 10 transit lifelines. So it's a summary of the 10 transit lifelines. And let's see. Are you able to see it? Let me see. You should be able to see my screen. I'm just checking.
Right now, I still just see the PowerPoint.
Yeah, I think on the tech side, they have to Hold on. Oh, there you go. Perfect. Okay, so now I'm gonna be able to play it from my end. Hold on. And so let's just make sure sound is there. I hope it works.
I couldn't get on time to my appointments because it's not efficient enough. Necesitamos más transporte. We need it now.
It takes too long to get anywhere.
Oh, hold on. Let me stop that.
My name is Lourdes Garcia Chepe. I'm late.
Okay, so I think we were successful with that. Was there any echo?
Sounded great.
Okay, perfect. So let me go back to the presentation and just share the, let's see. And so then, so that video introduces the 10 transit lifelines that are listed here. And as you could see, we have comprehensive transit issues and we need comprehensive solutions. So they include heavy infrastructure issues like building a new trolley line, express line on the blue line, or a purple line. But it also includes restrooms, something that's really basic as restrooms, or it looks at anti-displacement strategies and free passes for youth. So it's having a comprehensive agenda that transit riders want to advance. And I'm happy to report that as a result of a lot of organizing that included all the storytelling project, SANDEC, the Regional Metropolitan Planning Organization, adopted a plan in December of 2021 that includes a pathway to all these 10 transit lifelines. And so that's great. We got it in the planning, but now we got to make it into the funding. So that's another component. But let me share the next story. The story is about Roddy. He's one of our most active members and one of our promotor. And it's a story about riding the bus to an emergency reality. So let me stop share. Let me share my screen and share his video. So let's see if once I see it ready in the, let's see. Okay, I see it. Okay.
My name is Roddy Jerome, and I live in Sea Heights. About 3 weeks ago, a friend was sent to the hospital via ambulance due to his extreme high blood pressure. On the way to the ER, he had had a major stroke. Upon hearing the news, I went into high anxiety mode. I knew I had to get to the ER quickly. Not having transportation, I impulsively jumped on the bus. I had to take a bus to a trolley. I had to take the trolley to another bus. And then I had to transfer to another bus. It was frustrating. I was frantic. I was angry. I just was thankful that I was able to get there. We need to improve bus frequencies, period. It takes too long to get anywhere.
Okay, and then the next story I will share is Alicia's story. Let me see. Perfect.
Mi nombre es Alicia Sánchez, soy residente de National City y tengo viviendo aquí en esta comunidad hace más de 20 años. Mi esposo, él padece de cáncer, él necesita la máquina respiratoria para poder dormir en la noche. Tuvimos una explosión muy fuerte, muy peligrosa. Ese día que fue la explosión, se oyó a mi casa porque estoy cerca de la naval, pero no pensamos que había sido un barco. Cuando salimos miramos el cielo muy sucio, una capa de humo. En la noche el filtro amaneció negro. No tuvimos un transporte público inmediato. Tardaron hasta 3 días para poder sacarnos de la comunidad. Nos impactó mucho. Entonces necesitamos algo seguro como un transporte público que sea gratuito para la comunidad. En caso de desastres, caso de una evacuación.
So that's the last video. Let me just close the presentation. Sorry. Okay, so the slides are not coming up, but I will. Oh, perfect. So that was Alicia's story. So like I mentioned, we have a plan, but now we have to identify the funding. And we worked on a transit measure as part of this coalition that you see right here called the Let's Go San Diego to fund the regional plan. And we collected a lot of signatures for a community-based organization. We submitted as a organization, we submitted 2,000 signatures in May. The coalition submitted over 140,000. But unfortunately, the measure did not qualify for the November election. And so right now where we're at is based on all the abundance of interest in this measure, we're saying we're ready to launch a transit riders union. And the campaign is looking at a 2024 transit measure, potentially. And so we're going to use this time to build and continue to raise the capacity on the transit riders end. So I'll end it there. Thank you so much.
Y'all, that's where you should have shouted. You missed your opportunity to rejoice that what the powers that be meant for evil is turning into a powerful transit riders union. So much in what Caro just presented, both that the most directly impacted, targeted, marginalized communities have is comprehensive solutions, right? Comprehensive solutions through multi-tactical strategies that are being executed by multi-sector coalitions that are led by the most directly impacted communities of color in San Diego. There's so much more there. Hopefully we'll have some time to unpack it in the Q&A. I want to remind folks that the chat is available to you. If you hear something you like, say amen. If you hear something you don't understand, ask a question. We hope to have some time here at the end of the presentations after Taren takes us home to answer some of your questions. I will kick us off with a few, but be putting your questions in the chat so we can pull them out and bring you into the space. So with that, give it up one more time for Caro's presentation, the incredible work that's happening in California. And with that, Taren, I will toss it into your capable hands.
Thank you. So I'm Taren Evans. I'm the Environmental Justice Director at the Coalition of Communities of Color. And today I'm going to be sharing about some of the climate and health advocacy work that CCC has been working on recently. Next slide, please. Oh, well, that's strange. Could you actually, okay. Well, I don't know why that's just like a black square, but it's supposed to be a picture of like CCC members. So the Coalition of Communities of Color is an alliance of culturally specific community-based organizations located in the Portland, Oregon metro area. We support a collective racial justice effort to improve outcomes for communities of color through policy analysis and advocacy, environmental justice, culturally appropriate data and research, and leadership development in communities of color. Next slide. And here are just a couple of the key principles that guide our environmental justice work. The first being preventing harm. That means protecting underserved communities locally and globally from environmental harms, negative financial impacts, disruption of social cohesion, and other impacts as a result of environmental and climate policies. The second one is providing benefit and looking at reinvesting revenue to reduce disparities and create opportunities directly in underserved communities, and ensuring equitable distribution of multiple benefits, social, economic, and environmental. And the last one is ensuring inclusive design and implementation, and really supporting accountable and equitable policy development, implementation, and monitoring through involvement and leadership of the most impacted communities. Next slide, please. And as we've heard already a lot today, like climate change, while it does certainly affect everyone, it affects low-income communities and communities of color more than other communities. Next slide, please. And on this slide, you can see this is a map of Portland, and the darker purple areas are where communities of color are concentrated. And then you can see like the little like smokestack images are where there are like major polluting facilities. So you can definitely kind of see that there's a correlation between where those communities are located and those polluting facilities. Next slide. And this is another map of Portland, and this one shows how hot different areas of the city are. And the red areas of the city are the hotter areas. You can see there is a lot of red around. Mostly those are kind of like major highways and roads in Portland. And that's also an area, particularly in like the eastern part of the city. We have a very major highway, 82nd Avenue. And we do have like a lot of communities of color that are located in that area. And a lot of people might not know this, but Portland is actually the city with the greatest heat difference between different parts of the city. I mean, so you can see like the western part of the city, you don't see much red there. That's largely because that's where Forest Park is, which is one of the largest urban parks in the United States, and also the West Hills of Portland surrounding Forest Park, which is a very affluent area. Next slide, please. And this next slide kind of illustrates that point a little bit more. It shows tree canopy coverage. So on one side, you can see an area where the median income is $39,000, and are not seeing a lot of green on that in that image. And then we're looking at another area where the median income is $161,000, and you can see there's a lot more tree canopy in those more wealthy neighborhoods. Next slide. So next I'll be talking about some of the work that we've been doing to address these disparities and talking about some of the advocacy efforts that CCC has been a part of. Next slide. And I'll start by talking about our work on the Oregon Clean Energy Opportunity Campaign. So CCC, along with other coalition partners, helped to pass 3 bills. And I know that does say this year, that actually should say last year. That was last summer that we passed those 3 bills. These bills included 100% clean energy for all, energy affordability, and healthy homes. Next slide. And this slide just shows the broad range of organizations that were a part of our coalition. And the coalition was really intentional about centering environmental justice organizations that either work directly with members of communities of color or organizations that center racial justice and equity in their work, to ensure that the campaign was really led and steered by these organizations. These organizations, these organizations made the executive decisions around policy development, political strategy, and we had other advocates who were supporting organizations who provided capacity and support throughout the campaign. But ultimately, it was the frontline organizations that made final decisions, and that really helped to ensure that the campaign was really addressing the needs of the communities that we work with. And so as you can see, it's a really broad range of groups and organizations working at different intersections of health, clean energy, and environment, all working together toward a shared goal of making the energy system cleaner, greener, and more affordable. Next slide. Another component of our campaign was an Energy Justice Leadership Institute. And that brought together over 100 community members all across the state of Oregon to learn more about like the electricity system. We had like activities where we, had folks bring in like their electric bills, and we kind of like analyzed them and like went through like, what do these charges mean and things like that. And there was also a political education component of the campaign. So we talked about things like, how do you write a letter to the editor, and how do you give like public testimony? Next slide, please. And so this slide just goes a little deeper into the first bill that I mentioned, which was the Clean Energy for All bill. And this set a 100% clean standard that applies to the state's energy companies. So they need to reach 100% emission-free power by 2040 with really strong interim targets. You can see it's 90% by 2035 and 80% by 2030. It also requires tribal consultation for clean energy projects and bans the siting of new and expanded fossil fuel power plants. And the bill also has really strong labor standards and sets aside $50 million for community-based energy projects. Next slide. The next bill is the Energy Affordability Bill. And so that really addresses energy burden, which is the percentage of household income spent on energy costs. And it allows utilities to create a specific rate class for low-income customers and considers environmental justice factors and energy burden when rates are set for customers. And low-income households in communities of color tend to be those that are the most energy burdened typically. So this bill is really working to address that disparity to make sure that people are not stuck making difficult financial decisions about essentials like food or medicine or rent as they're weighing like those utility costs. The bill, it also provides resources for organizations and groups that work with low-income folks and communities of color to participate in policy decision-making spaces that happen at the Public Utilities Commission. And these are processes that tend to be very inaccessible to community members. They're really wonky, like kind of jargon-filled spaces. But they are also spaces that are very important and that have a big impact on like our communities. So it's critical for our communities to be a part of those spaces. So it's really important that bill provided the funding to allow organizations that serve low-income communities and communities of color to provide them with funding to participate in those spaces. The next slide. So the next slide, I was just talking about jargon. So this one just kind of talks about what exactly energy burden is. So it describes the percentage of someone's income that goes to energy bills, and paying more than 6% toward energy bills is considered energy burden. Next slide. And this goes over the final bill of the Oregon Clean Energy Opportunity Campaign, the Healthy Homes Bill. And this bill creates a funded program to fund home upgrades and retrofits and repairs like lead and radon abatement, fire hardening, removal of asthma triggers or allergen triggers, installation of air purification systems, which is especially important in Portland to protect people from wildfire smoke in their homes. And 54% of Oregonians actually live in housing built before 1978. So many homes have issues with mold or really cold or not safe from when there's the air quality outside is unhealthy. And this increased exposure definitely contributes to illness. So having a home that is really warm and health and safe is really important to community health and safety. And this program is administered by the Oregon Health Authority. It's called the Healthy Homes Program, and it provides funding for types of projects and funding for organizations and housing authorities that work with low-income communities and environmental justice communities. The bill also makes sure that state agencies are talking to one another about home improvement programs so that we make sure projects are happening in homes where they need to happen and money is going where it needs to go. Next slide. And then this just kind of goes over some of the benefits of the Healthy Homes Bill. Folks are able to spend less money on heating and cooling, have a refuge from bad outdoor air quality, experience fewer sick days and emergency room visits, live in more disaster resilient homes. It also creates good local jobs in home retrofitting and reduces burden on the healthcare system. Next slide. And this was a bill that was passed this year, emergency heat relief for Oregonians bill. And it was in response to last summer's extreme heat wave in Portland. Not sure how many of you know about this, but last summer we had a very unprecedented heat wave in Portland. Temperatures reached 116 degrees, which is just for Portland, where people are not used to that sort of weather at all, it was just kind of unbelievable. So this provides funds for emergency distribution of air conditioners and air filters, and removes barriers for renters installing air conditioners in apartment buildings. Next slide. And this is about another project that CCC is engaged in, also very much related to energy justice. So this is a group of BIPOC community leaders in the Portland metro area. We're called Building Community Shifting Power, or Build Shift for short. Next slide. And the mission of Build Shift is that we seek to build community across the Portland metro area, share knowledge and community wisdom, and shift political power to Black and Brown folks through leadership development and participatory policy making. Next slide. And this is a slide from one of our, the very first community convenings that we had way back in 2019. So that's why people are close to each other and no one's wearing masks. So some of the main findings from that community workshop were that people thought that there should be minimum housing quality standards for rentals to help really lower utility bills and improve health, safety, and comfort. They wanted stable rent when those improvements are made and incentives to invest in clean energy, which is a really important point because a lot of times, if you have housing that is very energy efficient, when those investments are made, then the first thing that happens is the landlord is going to probably pass those costs along and result in displacement for low income communities and communities of color. They also prioritize renter right to know energy cost information and wanted to have a sense of what utility bills were going to be before signing a rental agreement. Next slide. Yeah, and next one. So this is from another workshop that we did, was specifically a workshop about energy burden. And we did kind of a word cloud exercise where we asked folks what energy burden feels like. And you can see some of the most common answers there are stress, guilt about not being able to pay your bills, or having a cold home for your kids, or an anxiety. And I think it's really important because I think in terms of health, sometimes we don't think about sort of like the mental health impacts that, some of these issues are having on our community. Next slide. This is from another workshop that we had, which was specifically a policy workshop last summer. A lot of these recommendations are pretty similar to the first workshop that I went through. The community recommendations where people wanted minimum standards and upgrades for residential buildings, incentives for energy efficiency, more energy assistance, and accessibility of building information to tenants. Next slide. And so these are some of the key things that came out of like all of our kind of community meetings and outreach. We developed this acronym called the HEART Standards, which stands for Health, Equitable Energy, Anti-Displacement, Resilience, and Temperature. And we've been doing some broader stakeholder engagement over the past couple of months, and are hoping, or in the process, working with the city of Portland to draft an ordinance that will hopefully go to city council by the end of the year, establishing these standards for rental properties. Next slide. And next, I'm going to talk a bit about our water justice work. So the work that we've been engaged in is called the Oregon Water Futures Project. It's really about illuminating what water justice means to Oregonians on the front lines of water challenges through community conversations and partnerships. Really about lifting up the voices of like BIPOC communities and rural communities throughout the state of Oregon, and identifying community priorities for water and culturally specific resiliency. Also about building capacity around water advocacy. Next slide. So this is one of the community-based organizations that we partnered with, PICUN. I'll just read this quote from Tomas, who participated in the project. It is very important to create spaces for conversations in our communities about our environment and water. It enriches our knowledge about conservation practices that we can implement every day, at the same time that it broadens our awareness to continue advocating to guarantee access to clean water and accessibility for all, or accessible to all. Next slide. And this is just kind of goes over our community engagement approach, very much focused on relationship building, co-creating the outreach, being very flexible, realizing that there's not like a one size fits all approach. Next slide. And this just shows like kind of like the different areas where we had those conversations throughout the state of Oregon. We had 2 online gatherings, 75 phone interviews, multilingual conversations, about a little over 100 total participants. And then the list kind of just lists some of the different groups that we connected with. They're mostly lower income and working class, many renters, but a couple homeowners. Next slide. And I'll just kind of quickly go through some of our statewide themes that we had. Water values. One thing that we heard, there was a need for support of local leadership and knowledge. We heard from community members that they were really interested in learning more about water justice work. A lot of folks were just really curious. They were like, I don't know where my water comes from. I don't know if my water is safe. So people seem to be just really hungry for that sort of knowledge. Also capacity, we heard as a major theme in terms of investing in community capacity. A lot of the community-based organizations that we connected with across the state were like, yeah, this is very important and we're really interested in it, but we are a really small organization and we don't necessarily have enough capacity to engage fully in this space. So really looking at investing in community capacity so folks are able to engage more in the water justice space. We also heard really strongly that there was like some distrust of like water infrastructure, and folks had issues in terms of like emergency communications and not receiving really important notifications regarding water at times. And similar to our buildings work, people just wanted more access to information and improving renter education, and also farm worker protections came up a lot. Next slide. Some other themes we heard, just like that there are serious water challenges, as I mentioned, needing more community funding, affordability. A lot of programs actually for water assistance are targeted at homeowners. Like if you're a renter, you don't necessarily have your own, well, most renters don't necessarily have their own like water bill, but it just goes to the landlord. And so if you don't have that, a lot of times you aren't able to receive that assistance. Another thing was well water. There's not a lot of well water regulation in the state of Oregon, so that was an issue that we heard a lot about. And another issue was emergency preparedness and needing more like culturally inclusive emergency response plans and CBO partnerships. Next slide. So what's next? The Oregon Water Justice Framework. And that's really connecting what we had and heard in all of those community conversations to really tangible policy pathways to try to address those concerns. We're working on that right now and hoping to finalize it by the end of the summer and use that as a guiding document for upcoming legislative sessions. We're also working on community leadership and capacity building through doing a Water Justice Leadership Institute, kind of modeled on the Energy Justice Leadership Institute that I mentioned. We're also doing movement building work and establishing an Oregon Water Justice Network that we just started in the past few months, meeting monthly and connecting with folks across the state who are doing water justice work in Oregon. Next slide. And this is my final slide. This is just kind of like our overall approach to our climate justice work and really wanting to make sure that it's community driven. This is actually a slide from the Movement Strategy Center, the spectrum of community engagement to ownership. And it starts with like ignore and goes all the way to like deferring to community. And what we're really trying to do in a lot of work is move the needle and shift from that ignoring, informing, and consulting to really like transformational work that shifts in like where there is real like deferment to community and realization that the most impacted people, you know, that we need to value their knowledge and realize that like lived experience is, you know, is very valuable. A lot of times I feel like we really elevate the importance of technical expertise and don't realize like the amount of knowledge and wisdom that is in our own communities. So we're really trying to move the needle and shift that. And that is it.
Trying to shift the needle is as a humble flex. What we just saw in that presentation is that they absolutely are. And they're not only going after what should be the lowest hanging fruit kind of policy demands, but they're also pushing for transformative demands that change the infrastructure and power dynamics of these directly impacted communities as well. So I need you to lose your mind in the chat right now for the incredible work that Taren's been stewarding and for the grassroots communities that are leading those efforts. Just give some love in the chat. I just want to be clear. What you've heard from this presentation and the previous two is that, again, this sort of multi-sector, directly impacted led, multi-tactical intervention is actually what's getting the goods, right? You heard that people have used everything from petitioning to policy creation, that they are doing political education for the sake of base building and power building and community organizing. You've heard the important role of cultural organizing, doing work at the nexus of movement building and art and culture. All of those things is what is changing the conditions in these grassroots communities. Y'all, we do not have enough time to get into the deep details of how they are actually bending the moral arc of the universe towards justice in a way that centers health, equity, and climate, though you've heard just a taste of it. It's the beginning of a conversation, not the end of one as we arrive at the end of this session. What I also want to remind folks of is that they are also figuring out ways and creating models that we can all take this and move on it and build these movements to scale. I wish we had time to hear more about how they are doing that, but unfortunately, there is a closing plenary that I must send you off to today. So with that, I'm gonna make a commitment that one, this not be the last time you see these incredible people talking about this incredible work. I'm going to encourage you to go to the links in the chat. Thank you, tech team, for dropping those so that you can connect to these organizations yourself. And if you have more questions, feel free to use their contact us links to make sure that you get them through. And I just want you to take a second of your day to show and extend incredible amounts of love and support and solidarity to these incredible women. Give it up for Samantha and Caro and Taren. Thank you so much for spending some time sharing your brilliance with us. And thank you all for participating in today's panel. We will see you at the closing plenary. Love y'all.